Today, I want to talk to you about something that is often difficult to discuss and has historically been surrounded by shame, silence, and stigma. Depression. I have spent nearly a decade of my life in psychiatry research with one main motivation: to break down these walls of stigma so that the conversations around mental health can feel less isolating and a little bit more human. But before we go any further, I'd like to request you all to please join me in a quick exercise. Please take a moment, maybe even close your eyes if it feels comforting, and really try and connect to a moment where either you or someone you love had a really difficult time. When even getting out of bed felt like too much to handle. We have all had those moments. But what I want to explore today is how's that different from clinical depression, which is not just one hard moment, but an intense, persistent amplification of these struggles. But here's where things get messy. We all know someone who'd say things like, "Oh, my girlfriend didn't text me back for 2 days. I am so depressed." No, you're not depressed, my friend. She just doesn't like you anymore. Sorry. But for those who have been diagnosed with major depressive disorder, or MDD, the reality is far more serious. It is a medical condition which involves persistent, intense symptoms lasting at least 2 weeks. These include a remarkable loss of interest in daily activities, a significant psychomotor changes, extreme fatigue, difficulty making even smallest decisions, major shifts in body weight and sleep patterns, and at the core of it all lies suicidal thoughts. Right now, more than 300 million people worldwide are suffering from depression, and over 90% of suicide victims have been diagnosed with a depressive disorder. These are just not statistics. This means that in our next family dinner, in a party of 20 people, the chances are that at least one of them has been silently suffering from depression. And the risk isn't random. If a parent has depression, the chances are that their children are 3 to 4 times more likely to experience it too. In identical twins, the genetic risk for depression is over 40%. So please raise your hand if you think depression is caused by genetics or our DNA. Now keep them up if you think it's caused by environment like poverty, stress, trauma. Now, how many of you think it's caused by both? Okay, well, that's the right answer. And for those who didn't raise their hands, relax, it's not depression. It's just you ignoring me. Or maybe it's social anxiety. You choose. So, even though depression tends to run in family, not everyone who inherits a high genetic risk for depression will go on to develop it. On the other hand, many people suffer from devastating life situations, such as childhood abuse, one of the major risk factors for depression. But a lot of them emerge without developing the disorder. So depression is not destiny. It's not bad luck. What is depression? I think in my own philosophical way, depression is an intricate dance between genetics and environment. I'm Anjali Chawla. I'm a PhD candidate in neuroscience at McGill University, and have spent many days over the last few years trying to understand this dance. I like to think of depression as Tandav, which is a divine, vigorous, fierce dance where genetics and environment are in powerful synchrony. And when this balance is lost, the dance collapses. And this collapse can lead to psychiatric and complex disorders, including depression. This dance of genetics and environment during human development have been termed by C.H. Waddington in 1957 as epigenetics. Imagine a ball rolling down a hilly landscape. The starting point of the ball or our genetics doesn't determine the final path or the outcome. The contours of the landscape also determine the final path, which is the environment. Think of epigenetics as a software interfacing with your genetic hardware. It doesn't change the code, but it decides which genes to turn on and which to turn off. It is dynamic, it is personal, and it is an ongoing conversation between our brain and our surroundings. So, how do we detangle this complex web of genetics and environment? We start at the source, the human brain. But before I go any further, I'd like to extend my gratitude to those who donated their brain and their families who donated the brains of their loved ones in the time of their deepest grief for research. So in lab, I have the access and privilege to study the postmortem human brains of individuals who during an episode of major depression died by suicide. I extract DNA from their brain cells, and then I only keep the active regions of the genome. I tag them with a unique molecular barcode so that we can trace the DNA fragments back to the original cell. And then using computational methods, we build a high-resolution molecular map. And in this map, you can see that every single dot is a brain cell, and we can capture many different cell types from these brains. So what did we find? By zooming into these brain cells, one after the other, we found that about 5,000 DNA regions spanning over 2,000 genes behave differently in depressed patients compared to neurotypical individuals. In fact, 75% of these DNA regions showed reduced activity, a kind of a molecular shutdown. But this shutdown wasn't global. It was specific to a type of cells called microglia. Microglia are brain's immune cells. And think of them as like the brain's sanitation crew, which clears out the debris, it fights infections, and it keeps our neurons healthy. But here's the twist. Microglia didn't show any signs of genetic risk for depression. So it may be that the dysfunctions observed in microglia may be coming from the environmental triggers, like inflammation, tissue microenvironment, and so on. Great. So where is the genetic risk for depression in the brain? Well, we have found the answer. And we found that the genetic heritability for depression and also, interestingly, insomnia, which is sleeplessness, is concentrated in deep layers of the cortex in these neurons marked by a gene called NR4A2. NR4A2, other than being my favorite gene these days, is also a master regulator. It tunes how neurons respond to stress, learning, activity. It also regulates dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation and movement, the very spark that gets you out of bed in the morning. So here's the key insight. The neurons, which were found to be the hotspots of genetic variation, can also respond to environmental cues. Well, in short, we found that the genetic variation for depression affects neuronal functions, while environmental factors might be changing the functions of our immune system. Well, that's great, but now I wish I could stand here and tell you guys that we found the pill. Take this and you'll never feel depressed again. But unfortunately, that's not how research works. Although we have found the vulnerable cell types and genes most affected in depression, but it will take time before we can develop therapies that can target them clinically. But there is something that we can take home today. Number one, immune health matters. Taking care of our brain and our body through things that support a healthy immune system, diet, exercise, movement, can actually give us a fighting chance against depression. Second, genetics matter, which means depression is not psychological weakness. It's not something that money and luxury can always protect us against. We have found evidence for the genetic risk for depression in the deep layer neurons of the cortex. And since the very same neurons, because of the gene NR4A2, could be amenable to activity-dependent changes, there is an opportunity. It means that behavioral interventions like physical activity, active learning, building positive habits, and sleep hygiene, yeah, what a concept, the old-fashioned boring sleep, could be doorways to resilience. So, if I had to leave you with one last image, it would be this. Think of depression like a Jenga. Genetics is the foundational structure. Life pulls out pieces. Stress, poverty, trauma, girlfriend left me. But here's the good news. You can add blocks of stability. Healthy environments, nourishing routines, which can not possibly guarantee that the tower will never collapse, but it sure will make the game last longer. Thank you.